one of the most important parts of what it means to be a real person and a real follower of Jesus is to wholeheartedly acknowledge our everyday existence. It is to allow space for all of its setbacks and its thrills. It's peaceful mornings and its incredibly chaotic afternoons. It's to honor the moments just as they are, the highs and the lows, just as they arrive for us. See, to live this way is to embrace the good parts in the midst of what we might call the nitty-gritty pieces of life. And I, for one, wish that came easy. That good things were just so built into everything that we didn't have to work at seeing them. This past week, just back on Tuesday, my Aunt Brenda's funeral was held on Tuesday up in Midland. And before the funeral began, we had an opportunity just to gather as family. And this was kind of like all my cousins. It was aunts and uncles or siblings of my Aunt Brenda. And then her immediate family. We gathered in a side room to essentially to pray together. And I didn't have to officiate the funeral, which I was very thankful for. But in that moment, I was asked to just kind of offer a prayer. And we've all been through these different loss moments, I think. I look around the room, and it's an emotional situation. And I couldn't help but acknowledge that there was big loss. There was big sadness in that room. But ultimately, there was big sadness because my Aunt Brenda loved big. You see, through accepting reality, we find a greater capacity somewhere within us to love and to feel what is. And when we make the effort to maybe stop arguing with or maybe just trying to always war against reality, we then are able to instead soften into trust that we can better discover what is good. See, that it's hard for us to lean into the difficult things of life and to trust that our feelings and our experience of just what is can actually help us discover what is beautiful. But you see, that's the path that Joseph has been on up to this point in his story. We've covered quite a few chapters. And today we are diving into Genesis chapter 41, which is a pivotal chapter in the life of Joseph. Now, last week I left you with sort of an ominous verse at the end of chapter 40. See, it was after helping and hoping that the cupbearer would pass along a big favor for Joseph and help him get released from prison for a crime he didn't commit. We were told this right at the end of chapter 40. He said, "The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him." And then if we go over just to the first half of the first verse of chapter 41, it says, "When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream." We're going to stop there for a quick second and catch ourselves. So, at the time of the cupbearer's release from prison, Joseph had already been in prison for about 10 years. And now we are told that Joseph remains in prison for 2 more years. Now, this could have been a pretty dark time for Joseph, right? He seemed so close to a big change of circumstances, only to have it slip away. And I wonder, do you think Joseph got tired of waiting? And I think we can all collectively go, duh, yes. Do you think he was worn down a bit by this difficult reality? So today we are going to work our way through chapter 41 and consider a few aspects of how Joseph's unpredictable journey prepared him to see glimpses of goodness. So we're going to pick it up now in Genesis 41. We're going to start with 1 through 13. This is kind of the biggest chunk we'll hit all at once. So you can follow along here on the screens. It says this: "When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Some of you maybe can relate to just bizarre dreams, right? You have those. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled. So he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him of our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." So we're going to pause there. Now, we don't know if Joseph could really see it yet or not, but God is setting up the events that will lead to his release from prison and even bigger things. In quick order, he is about to become what we would kind of call the head of state of a giant, powerful world empire. The second most powerful man in Egypt is where he was headed. And even Pharaoh, along with him, is being prepared to receive rescue from the living God all through Joseph. Now, as we just read, Pharaoh has these dreams and then goes to the representatives of his gods. And all of his advisors fail to interpret these dreams. After Pharaoh's advisors fail to help him, the chief cupbearer comes out of the woodwork and tells Pharaoh about the amazing dream interpreter that he met in prison. And we all collectively say, finally, about time, right? Wouldn't we? That's how I read it. Joseph's like, dude, thank you. So we pick it back up now. A couple more verses here. It says, so Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Pharaoh here, in all his power and prestige, comes to Joseph because he's heard that he can interpret dreams. Think with me about the temptation that Joseph must have felt in this moment to exalt himself, to make himself worthy, to make sure that he gets set free. And what does Joseph say? The first words out of his mouth are, I cannot do it. He says, I cannot do it. It's not me. As a quick side, we just went through a presidential power change, right? Like we just went through a transfer of power. Can you imagine anyone in any of these meetings now wanting to be part of Donald Trump's administration saying, well, it's not me that can do it, but I want in. That's not how we talk, right? Yet, Joseph leads with that. And it's here and now, after growing and building up Joseph through a lot of hurts, a lot of adversity, that God reveals some major goodness. And Joseph is patiently waiting. he's still there pointing straight to God. He says, I cannot, but God will give Pharaoh an answer. For Joseph, there was no rush. There was no quick posturing to take center stage. There's just more calm anticipation of good things. There's two things right here that I just want to stop and point out. And first one is that, we say these things, but it's nice to see it. We say timing matters, but timing does matter. You see, God's timing isn't rushed. It's not delayed. Joseph went from a pit, then sold into slavery, and then spending years in a prison. But at this moment, God opens the doors for his release. And another part of this that I find so interesting, and we've experienced these moments in our life, but how Pharaoh's needs, this guy was top of the world, yet his need aligns with Joseph's gift. Pharaoh's dreams, these visions of 7 years of abundance followed by these 7 years of famine, set the stage for Joseph's God-given ability to interpret them and then to eventually deal with what is coming. Now, I know that for us, we sit with the reality that God's timing is often much, much slower than we would like. I appreciate at least seeing a few head nods. That's how I feel most weeks, quite frankly. We wonder, what is going on here? Why hasn't this thing happened yet? Why am I stuck here? But I want us to be reminded this morning that God's delays, even if they seem to take most of our lifetime, are not denials. There is still goodness to be seen even in our very unsettled realities. We are only being called to trust God. Most specifically, trust God while we wait. So here, kind of in the middle of our chapter, we won't read this specifically, but Pharaoh then goes about recounting his dreams to Joseph. And we're told that Joseph, full of the Spirit of God, interprets the dreams. And there will be 7 years of plenty and abundance that are coming, but it'll be followed by 7 years of a horrible famine. And so Joseph interprets this dream, but he doesn't just stop with the interpretation. He actually goes on to propose a solution. And that's where we'll pick it back up now at verse 33. It says this, "And now," this is Joseph talking, "let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held and reserved for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." I find it interesting that Joseph doesn't put himself forward as a possible solution to the problem. He doesn't say, "Ta-da, I'm your man," right? We don't see that. Instead, he just simply suggests that Pharaoh should find a guy. And I wonder, as you kind of come across that text, do you think that Joseph didn't know that he was the ideal man for the job? I mean, the dude had a track record of working himself to a pretty elite position quickly. We saw that when he was sold into slavery and he ends up in Potiphar's house, right? And he's in charge of his entire house. Then we see it even when he goes to prison. He quickly is the right-hand man to the warden. I mean, Joseph has a really good track record. And so there's a couple things to point out here as well. First is that Joseph has a lot of wisdom. He advises Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning leader to oversee a plan for storing the grain during the years of abundance. And he does this because this would help ensure the survival throughout that famine, and it would set the nation of Egypt up to thrive even during the harshest parts of what was to come. And then Joseph also, his readiness, right? We see how a clear-minded and a confident Joseph, what kind of a person he is. His years of hardship hadn't left him bitter or paralyzed by it. Instead, they actually prepared him. He had developed a heart that trusted God above all and a mind that could think practically. He had a mind that could think realistically. Joseph had the ability to deal with reality. And this all reminds me that our faith, folks, is not passive. It must be active. Joseph trusted God, but also acted with wisdom and discernment so as to keep his eyes open for any goodness and any opportunities that came his way. And for us, we have to ask ourselves, how are we preparing for the seasons ahead in our own lives? Are you using today's realities? Okay, that could be highs and lows. Are you using today's opportunities to prepare for what the challenges will be tomorrow? We're going to pick it back up now in verse 37. This will be our last little chunk that we'll read directly from the text. It said this: the plan seemed good to Pharaoh, what Joseph had laid out for him, and to all of his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way." Thus, he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. See, Pharaoh recognizes virtue in Joseph, specifically his connection to God, and he appoints him as second in command over all of Egypt. I mean, this moment is a powerful turning point, not only in Joseph's life, but in the lives of countless people who would be saved because of his leadership. It's also this beautiful picture of God's, dare we even say, extravagant provision. How God is moving and positioning his people to do things like bring order to chaos, to bring help in times of need, and to bring hope that tomorrow is going to be okay. And here, God's goodness doesn't arrive in the way we might expect, through maybe a supernatural display. We see that elsewhere in Scripture. But rather, God's goodness arrives through the everyday efforts of Joseph's faithfulness and his implementing the wisdom he's been given. And the good that Joseph gets to experience is not only this rewarding promotion. I'm sure it felt good, though. I mean, to go from a pit, sold into slavery, to prison, now second in command over the biggest world empire at the time. Like, whoa. That's a pretty amazing thing. But it wasn't just a rewarding promotion, but it's actually now a great new responsibility. He is placed in a position to steward resources and to save lives. And that's because faith and responsibility go hand in hand. Joseph's rise to power wasn't simply about his personal redemption arc. It was actually part of God's larger plan to provide and take care of an entire region. so we should be reminded this morning that glimpses of goodness are the ripple effects of obedience. I mean, imagine with me if Joseph had just given up during his years in prison and allowed bitterness to take root. His faith and his resiliency through those hard things not only shaped his character, bringing him closer to maturity, but also allowed God to use him as a vessel for goodness for others too. For us, it should cause us to think a little bit. Can we see glimpses of beauty in our own life where God has used even the hardest of times to bring about something beautiful, something good? Joseph's story is reminding us that God is always working, even when we then have to work hard to see it. So this morning, as we get close to wrapping this one up, the question we're kind of driving at together a little bit is just how can we experience, how can we actually see these glimpses of goodness around us as we travel this long road toward good? And your actionable step, if you will, here today is to look hard for goodness. To look for goodness. You will have to open your eyes and engage a bit. Any head nods with that? Is it a little hard to see some goodness right now, sitting here, January 26, 2025? Whew, yeah, that can be a struggle. But Genesis 41 tells the story of Joseph's rise from prison to power, showing God's providence and faithfulness in fulfilling those promises he made to him during his own dreams. And despite enduring all these years of suffering, Joseph remained faithful and hopeful, which allowed him then to recognize and then to patiently embrace the goodness in his life as it arrived, even if it arrived so slowly. So I want to give you just a couple steps for those who appreciate the steps. Like, what could I maybe work on this week, Matt? And so a few steps to think about and consider a little further of how we can look hard for the goodness in our lives. And the first one is we can be faithful in small things. See, Joseph excelled even in prison because he was faithful in the responsibilities given to him. And so for us too, really what that means is that we can focus on doing whatever our current work is. And we do that with excellence. And we do it with integrity, trusting that God sees that and God honors our faithfulness. So we do that by being faithful in the small things. Another one is that we develop and keep a forward-focused mindset. And I've already mentioned it twice, but I think it bears one more repeating, that Joseph didn't allow bitterness or resentment to take root in his life. You don't have to raise your hand, but I will raise my hand for you. That in itself is difficult work, right? That is hard. Instead, what Joseph did was he somehow was always looking forward to what God would do next. And for us, I think that work is there too, that we have to reframe our challenges, our difficulties. And we do that by asking things like, okay, what is God teaching me here? Maybe we step back just for a moment and we pause and we ask questions like, how can this prepare me better for what lies ahead? And then one last little practical step for this morning is that I think it is incredibly helpful to see the goodness by being a blessing to others. Joseph used his promotions and his opportunities not just for himself, but he did use those to bless others. And I think we can follow his lead and we look for ways to serve or to encourage others today as well. Acts of kindness and compassion are always in season, right? Woohoo! They always have a way of reminding us of the good things that we have, even in our present realities as well. My last a little bit of encouragement to you this morning. I want to make sure that we understand that looking for goodness in our lives doesn't mean ignoring pain. It doesn't mean that we just think less of our very natural, strong emotions. Those are real things. Those are even good things. But rather, what it's about is seeking God's presence in the midst of all of it. As Joseph's life shows, goodness often emerges through perseverance and faith in God's unfailing promises to help move us forward to something better. So I don't want to try to pretend and paper over the suffering that you may be experiencing right now. I don't want to just gloss over the pain that you've endured for years. But I trust, in a way that I hope is even a tiny bit like Joseph trusts, that in the midst of all our difficult and painful and hard realities, there are glimpses of God's goodness all around. We're just going to have to keep looking very hard for them. Let's pray. Lord, we acknowledge just that. That's hard as we go through the ups and downs.